Amid freezing temperatures and destruction, people at the highest risk are already vulnerable, among them the elderly, those with disabilities, and the many millions displaced to which I referred earlier, essentially because of a lack of basic services. International humanitarian law speaks for itself. Objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population must be protected. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians and civilian objects throughout all military operations. Gender-based violence, targeting women and girls, continues to be pervasive, and we are very clear underreported. Madam President, our work is to safeguard lives and preserve dignity. The humanitarian community is committed still to stay and deliver, and almost 690 humanitarian organizations, partners, the majority of which are local frontline organizations, have and continue to provide life-critical aid and protection to 13.5 million people in Ukraine. And I don't apologize for this stream of really terrifying statistics. These people in the 690 humanitarian agencies continue to work against the clock to support civilians. And over the past few months in that context, in preparation for the winter, humanitarians have provided more than 630,000 civilians with different kinds of direct winter assistance, and 400 generators have been distributed to critical facilities. Since October, the sustained attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have created a new level of need that impacts the whole country and exacerbates and increases the needs caused by the war. The scale of the destruction of the electrical and heating infrastructure requires the international community's enhanced support to the government of Ukraine beyond what humanitarians can provide. And indeed, there are discussions to this end in Kyiv and elsewhere. In recent weeks, more areas have become accessible in eastern and southern oblasts, allowing humanitarians to reach entirely new communities with assistance, and we're grateful for this. Our teams are responding. Interagency convoys are moving to bring aid to areas where Ukraine has recently regained control. In Kherson, for example, convoys have delivered much-needed drinking water, potable water for thousands of civilians, medical supplies to treat 100,000 people for up to 3 months, and assistance for women and girls' reproductive health. And food assistance has been delivered in Kherson for nearly 100,000 civilians. Humanitarians working to respond to gender-based violence, including in particular local women's organizations, also are seeking to scale up the delivery of essential services for their clients. An integrated network of spaces and providers has been delivering survivor-centered services for women and girls, boys and men who have been subject to gender-based violence. And these efforts and activities, which began at the beginning of the war, continue. 765,000 children. It's very difficult to imagine this. 765,000 children have received psychosocial support to help them deal with the effects of war and displacement. Mobile teams are operating in centers for internally displaced and identifying, registering, assessing, and providing direct support to children with protection needs. None of this would be possible without the unprecedented member state and other donor support to the Ukraine Flash Appeal. And to date, we have received, as a result of that generosity, $3.1 billion of the $4.3 billion requested through the end of this year. To date, we have transferred almost $1 billion in humanitarian cash transfers to about 4.3 million people. Cash as a mode of delivery has come to its maturity in the case of the tragic events in Ukraine. More must be done, of course, to continue to close the funding shortfall, and we will soon be issuing plans for 2023. While there have been improvements, as I've said, in humanitarian access, the biggest challenge remains impediments to reaching areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Discussions continue between the UN and the parties to facilitate unimpeded access in those areas. It's vital that we get the convoys through to deliver relief items. OCHA has, as we have discussed in this chamber, a presence in Moscow, and I continue personally to engage key interlocutors for access in Moscow, in Kyiv, and in meetings elsewhere. Today, of the 13.5 million people who have been reached with assistance since February, 1 million of them are in areas outside government of Ukraine control. They have been reached thanks to humanitarian partners positioned still in areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, where humanitarian operations had begun, of course, since 2014 as a result of the invasion. While we continue to provide support in these regions through these local partners, and there are still international staff in those areas, our response is neither regular nor at the right scale. Under IHL, again, all parties should facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure that their personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. In areas where the government of Ukraine has recently regained control, the presence of landmines and explosive remnants of war is a major concern for communities and, of course, for humanitarians who serve them, and causes delay and impediments for the restoration of essential services, including electricity. States must bolster their support for clearance to prevent further casualties of these mines. This will ensure quicker, more effective access to livelihoods and essential services. And information on mines and used or abandoned explosive ordnance should be shared by those who know at the earliest possible time. Madam President, last week in Geneva, I launched the Global Humanitarian Overview, which is our annual assessment of global humanitarian needs for next year and how to respond to them. At the beginning of 2022, 274 million people needed humanitarian assistance. For 2023, the projected number has grown to 339 million, from 274 million to 339 million, an increase of about 24%. 65 million people have arrived at our doorstep, 1 in 23 people on this planet. And as we have said publicly, that's a population the size of the third most populous country in the world. This is a record appeal, and it would be difficult to get the adequate funding, but it's a stark reminder of how fast humanitarian needs are accelerating. And this is especially true for Ukraine. So I end partly about Ukraine, of course, and the urgent needs that we see as we move into winter, and as we see the damage to infrastructure, and as we see the potential for more displacement. But I place that within that larger context of a world gone mad, which sees 1 in 23 people in need of humanitarian assistance around the globe. It's a picture which is unimaginable. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie Monsieur Griffiths pour son intervention et toutes les agences des Nations Unies pour les opérations qu'elles conduisent dans des conditions très difficiles en Ukraine. La Russie poursuit son agression et elle utilise désormais l'hiver comme une arme de guerre. La France condamne avec la plus grande fermeté la poursuite des attaques massives de la Russie contre l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien. Elles ont de nouveau coûté hier la vie à de nombreux civils et endommagé des infrastructures essentielles. La France exprime ses condoléances aux victimes et aux proches des victimes. Ce ciblage systématique
This systematic targeting, whilst temperatures are now below zero, reflects a clear desire of Russia to make the Ukrainian people suffer, to deprive them of water, of heating, and of electricity in the hope of undermining their resistance. The cost of war for children is terrible. More than 500 medical facilities are being attacked or destroyed, according to the WHO. Today, 3.3 million children need humanitarian assistance, according to UNICEF. 2/3 of children have been displaced and were, since the 24th of February, 2,500 schools were destroyed or damaged. 5 million children therefore do not attend school. France welcomes the work of UNICEF and UNESCO to enable these displaced children to have access to education, including remotely. France condemns all deliberate attacks against schools and hospitals. These acts are serious crimes punishable by international law, and they are part of grave violations established by this Council's resolutions. We are counting on the United Nations monitoring and communication mechanism to verify these violations and to attribute responsibility. Those who kill children and attack schools in violation of IHL have their rightful place on the blacklist of the annual report of the Secretary General. In this context, France will continue to lend its full support to Ukrainian justice and to international jurisdictions, starting with the International Criminal Court. Mr. President, we call once again upon Russia to respect the order given by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March this year, and to bring an end to this unjustifiable and devastating war, and to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory in internationally recognized borders by the International Court. France welcomes the efforts of the Secretary General, of UN agencies, and of the ICRC. These have enabled several hundred civilians and injured persons to be evacuated from besieged areas. It is crucial that these continue, leaving the evacuated persons to choose their destination. The respect for IHL and human rights is non-negotiable. Humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Madam President, Ukraine stands on the side of peace in this conflict. While the Ukrainian president was presenting to the members of the G20 his 10-point action plan for peace, Russia responded by massive strikes on Ukrainian towns. Russia is obstructing peace by doubling down in an escalation seeking to shatter the resistance of the Ukrainian people. We commend the efforts of President Zelensky to undertake a path of peace. France stands ready to help it build a just and lasting peace. We remain fully mobilized to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, given the urgency of the situation. Whilst winter is setting in, France is co-organizing with Ukraine an international conference to support the resilience of the Ukrainian civil society on the 13th of December in Paris. The aim of the conference is to mobilize and coordinate assistance of the international community to help the Ukrainian population survive winter, with particular focus on 5 priority areas: energy, water, food and health infrastructure, and transport networks. Thank you very much.
I thank the Ambassador of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to thank Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths for his briefing. Mexico has taken note with great concern that, as was to be expected, the low temperatures are creating a new dimension in the humanitarian crisis being experienced by Ukraine. Unfortunately, the needs will continue to grow, as the conflict continues and as winter advances. This scenario is also a result of the intense attacks against the electrical infrastructure in Ukraine, which has left more than 10 million people without electricity and very many more without heating. The efforts to repair the damage until now has been insufficient. As we've heard, the health sector is one of the most severely affected by the disruption in the electrical supply. 70% of the attacks against the infrastructure, the health infrastructure around the world, in recent months has occurred in Ukraine. It is reported that hospitals and medical centers are carrying out operations under very limited health standards due to a lack of water and because of the interruption in the electrical supply. It's difficult for these establishments to function properly without these basic supplies. Also, the large-scale destruction of basic infrastructure is creating a whole host of obstacles for the production of and acquisition of medical equipment and medicines. To this, we have to add that the health personnel has also been forced to abandon their work posts, including their homes, as part of the serious problem of internal displacement made worse by the energy crisis. All of this means that the civilian population, the main victim of the conflict, has increasing problems in accessing health services, and this is happening just at the time when those services are more necessary. We reiterate our urgent call for putting an end to these attacks and to step up efforts to rebuild the power grid in order to ensure the supply of priority services. It is particularly important to guarantee the electrical supply for the nuclear power stations of Zaporizhzhia and in the south of Ukraine in order to avoid a nuclear disaster. As we have underscored on other occasions, international humanitarian law is unequivocal in its provisions. They require the protection of civilians and goods that are of a civilian nature. We need to put an end to these attacks and limit, as far as possible, the effects of the hostilities on the civilian population. Madam President, the conflict has drastically changed the reality for millions of Ukrainian girls and boys. In addition to the problems in accessing health services that I indicated previously, there are more than 3.6 million minors being affected by the disruption in school services. Likewise, girls and boys represent almost 20% of the displaced population, which increases the risk of contracting diseases or being victims of violence or being subject to trafficking since they are separated from their families. These will also be the girls and boys, the children that will pay the highest price, those that are paying the highest price in terms of their mental health. We heard the Undersecretary General Griffiths refer to this. 675,000 of these children have required social support. This is a great effort that is being conducted, but we have to still stress that it is estimated that double this amount, 1.5 million children, are at risk of suffering from depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and other conditions which require interventions, mental health interventions, and that will be required for a long time. So the psychosocial support services will have to continue to be a fundamental part of the humanitarian response, and that is why we will continue to insist on this matter and we request support from the members of the Council. It's also fundamental to make progress in the corresponding investigations to ensure accountability. In this regard, we will continue to closely follow the work of the International Criminal Court, an entity that is competent to conduct these tasks. Together with the efforts and the solidarity of the international community to assist the civilian population, we need to explore new options for mediation so that dialogue and diplomacy can play a greater part. That was the case of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has been so important for humanitarian purposes. But at the same time, it shows that there are ways to conclude agreements at the negotiating table. We reiterate, Madam President, our preparedness to work for the peace and stability in Ukraine, fully supporting its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and its political independence. Thank you very much.
I thank Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la...
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for his briefing, and I welcome the participation of Ukraine, Latvia, Poland, Germany, and the European Union in this meeting. We continue to follow developments in the war in Ukraine, a war which is ongoing and intensifying given the scale of its destruction. All of this without the least encouraging sign of the willingness, even if it's minimal, to silence the guns. The war in Ukraine clearly is aggravating global humanitarian needs that are growing exponentially. The non-respect by the warring parties of international humanitarian law, which can be seen by the recourse to, or the threat of the recourse to, weapons of mass destruction, is only increasing the risks of this war. The effects are well known. Very many people displaced, the majority of them women and children, whose most basic needs are not being met. A commission of inquiry of the Human Rights Council refers to the multiplication of threats against the rights and lives of young people, made worse by the attacks on civilian infrastructure, which therefore are increasing the immediate humanitarian needs. Women and girls are also being exposed to more significant risks of sexual violence. As the temperatures continue to go down, a number of families in Ukraine are deprived of electricity, heating, and drinking water. This certainly will further complicate the situation for vulnerable people, making it much more difficult for humanitarian workers to do their work on the ground. To date, more than 9.3 million people require food and subsistence assistance, and 14.5 million people are awaiting medical assistance, according to the last OCHA report. This situation should be speaking to all of us. My country calls upon the warring parties to respect their commitments according to international humanitarian law. We call upon the parties also to abstain from using weapons with indiscriminate effects, inflicting additional suffering on the civilian population. I'd like to stress the particular danger represented by landmines and unexploded remnants of war for the civilian population under the snow. And I would echo the appeal launched by the ICRC to the parties, and I quote, to mark and clean the contaminated areas as soon as possible and inform civilians of the dangers, end of quotation. The parties must absolutely ensure that these remnants, non-exploded remnants of war, do not hinder access for essential services and do not engender additional risks for the population and humanitarian workers. Madam President, my country welcomes the renewal of the grain agreement. The conclusion of this agreement has sent out a positive signal, which gives some hope that the parties can build on this basis in order to negotiate a cessation of hostilities. My country will continue to support a solution, and we call upon all parties to commit to this goal in order to put an end to the cycle of violence, terror, and belligerence. Prolonging this war will only extend the already long list of disasters, human losses, lives broken, and infrastructure destroyed. But it is also, and over and above all, the invisible wounds, rancor, animosity, which will make peaceful cohabitation an even more distant prospect. I'd like to exhort all of the parties to abstain from all radical rhetoric that will complicate the political issue. I reiterate the constant call of my country to this Council to keep open diplomatic channels in order to encourage the parties to meet, to open dialogue, in order to examine all possible avenues for putting an end to the conflict. We are looking at all different initiatives that will offer mediation to encourage the parties to envisage the end of the war with the goal of lasting peace and peaceful cohabitation. Given the disarray and despair of the population already weakened by months of war, it is not enough to have more and more meetings to inform the international community without ever offering a genuine alternative to war. The time has come to negotiate the end of the war. The Council must now come back to its primary vocation, which is to work towards peace and security in the world. I thank you, Madam President.
For their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank USG Martin Griffiths for updating the Council on recent developments in the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, which helps us better understand the effects of the conflict, in particular on vulnerable parts of the Ukrainian population. We welcome the recent visit of the UN Independent International Commission to Ukraine. Brazil fully shares the perception expressed by Commissioner Pablo de Greiff in a statement on Friday about the need for a victim-centered approach. From this perspective, nothing is more urgent than the establishment of a ceasefire between the parties without preconditions. Madam President, we also take note of statements by Western leaders over the past week about their willingness to engage in dialogue with Russia to end the hostilities. Although qualified by references to certain conditions, this is an important positive signal. These declarations have to translate into the establishment of a mechanism for conducting negotiations in a pragmatic and objective manner. Brazil believes that the Council could and should serve as a platform to initiate this dialogue and to explore proposals presented by other members for this purpose. Madam President, meanwhile, the protection of the civilian population, particularly children, and full respect for international humanitarian law must be upheld as a priority. Attacks against civilian targets constitute violations of international law and international humanitarian law. The condemnation of such attacks must therefore be accompanied by practical measures to end the victim's suffering and ensure lasting peace. Brazil is gravely concerned that serious violations against children may go unchecked in Ukraine. The end of the conflict depends on a political solution that offers the guarantees that the destruction we have witnessed in the last 9 months will not be repeated. The time has come for a deeper reflection on the architecture of European regional security, taking into account concerns of all states and the need to protect their sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I wish to thank USG Martin Griffith for his briefing. At present, the crisis in Ukraine is still unfolding. the humanitarian situation is deteriorating and the spillover effects continue to expand. There is no winner in conflicts and wars, while bloodshed and confrontations will only bring suffering to the people. Resolving the crisis in Ukraine through political means is in the best interest of the countries concerned and in the common interest of all countries of the world. China calls on the international community to support all efforts in seeking peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, step up good offices and mediation, and encourage parties concerned to restart negotiations as soon as possible so as to achieve a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities at an early date. Madam President, in the face of a global and compound crisis such as the one in Ukraine, we must adhere to the people-centered approach, prioritize humanity, and spare no effort in mitigating the spillover effects of the crisis. In this connection, I would like to highlight the following 4 points. First, to reduce humanitarian cost. Parties to the conflict should strictly uphold international humanitarian law, avoid launching attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, safeguard the normal operation of key public services such as energy, healthcare, and education, and resolutely eliminate security risks in nuclear facilities and supplies. The recent widespread power outage in Moldova was a cause for concern. Parties concerned shall exercise prudence and restraint by preventing the spillover of the war to its neighbors. In particular, avoiding misunderstanding and miscalculations while being vigilant of the risk of bloc confrontation. Second, to step up humanitarian assistance. The people of Ukraine are experiencing the dual challenges of war and a tough winter, with severe shortages of water, electricity, and heating supplies, and a significant increase in humanitarian needs. The international community and humanitarian agencies should help Ukraine repair damaged infrastructure as soon as possible, provide winter supplies and heating equipment to the Ukrainian people, and address the basic livelihood needs of vulnerable groups such as refugees and displaced persons. Children are most vulnerable to attacks and injuries in armed conflicts and should therefore be given priority protection. China calls for full consideration of the special needs of children in humanitarian operations, the provision of targeted assistance, and the prevention and elimination of violations against children. Third, to manage and control the spillover effects. The current global food and energy crises are not about production and demand, but about the supply chain and the disruption of international cooperation. China resolutely opposes the attempt to politicize food and energy issues and use them as tools and weapons, and calls for the removal of unilateral sanctions. Instead, we should maintain the momentum of global economic recovery and reduce the impact of the crisis on developing countries' implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We are pleased to see the renewal and continued implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and welcome Russia's donation of fertilizers to developing countries with food shortages. We thank the UN for coordinating this effort. Fourth, to respect the rights of prisoners of war. According to the Third Geneva Convention, prisoners of war are entitled to humane treatment and protection from torture, ill treatment, and other harm. Parties to the conflict should strictly uphold relevant international law and respect the basic rights of POWs. China welcomes the recent repeated exchanges of POWs between Russia and Ukraine and commends the UAE's invitation to both sides to discuss POWs and ammonia exports. We hope these positive contacts and interactions will help both sides build mutual trust and lay the foundation for the gradual resumption of negotiations. Madam President, I would like to reiterate that on the issue of Ukraine, China has always been standing on the side of peace, dialogue, and humanity. We will continue to work with all peace-loving countries to advocate the resolution of conflicts through negotiations and the settlement of disputes through consultations. We support all efforts that are conducive to a political solution to the crisis in Ukraine and to the restoration of peace and stability in Europe. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor now to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Undersecretary Griffiths, for your briefing today. Last Thursday, the UN released its Global Humanitarian Overview for 2023, which set another record with 339 million people in need of assistance and a price tag of $51 billion. When the UN launched its humanitarian needs overview last year, we wondered, how much worse could it get? Tragically, Russia's illegal war answered that question. Russia's aggression triggered one of the largest refugee and displacement crises since World War II. Hunger, already at extreme levels because of COVID, other conflicts, and climate change, has surged this year because Russia disrupted the world's global food systems. Russia turned Ukraine's rolling wheat fields into battlefields, and it intentionally destroyed the grain Ukraine once supplied to the developing world. Now, as Ukraine fights back to reclaim its sovereign territory and defend its people, President Putin has focused his ire and fire on Ukraine's civilian population. As temperatures plummet, Russia is launching a barrage of missiles at energy stations, adding to its destruction of critical infrastructure across Ukraine. These consequences are horrific and cause needless suffering. Roads, schools, and medical facilities have not been spared. As a result of the repeated strikes, children cannot attend school and doctors cannot treat the sick. And families are forced to make decisions about whether to freeze in their homes or join the millions of others already displaced in seeking safety from the horrors of war. We commend the government and people of Ukraine for their tremendous resilience and resolve in the face of this merciless aggression, and we commend the work done by the humanitarian community. Over the last 10 months of Russia's war, the UN and NGOs have delivered principled humanitarian aid under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. We heard this in October when humanitarian coordinator Denise Brown briefed the Council and described in sobering detail the human toll of this war. Humanitarian aid workers have shown they are willing to stay and deliver in the face of considerable security risks that too often have ended in the loss of life. It's notable that despite all obstacles, aid agencies in Ukraine managed to implement the largest humanitarian cash assistance program in history, transferring more than $1 billion to 6 million people. Since February 24th, the United States alone has provided over $1.5 billion in humanitarian aid to support the displaced, including refugees and other vulnerable populations and communities inside Ukraine and around the region. But we know more will be needed. We applaud France's initiative to hold an international conference focused on Ukraine's resilience on December 13th. The United States is also grateful for the UN's efforts to continue the Black Sea Grain Initiative that has succeeded in getting desperately needed food from Ukraine ports to world markets. This has helped lower food prices and ensure wheat purchased by the World Food Program reaches vulnerable people in Yemen, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Colleagues, during her recent visit to Ukraine, President Zelensky told Ambassador Thomas Greenfield that he seeks a just peace that is based on the UN Charter and its principles, which is what this Council is here to uphold and defend. President Putin's escalating barrages on Ukraine's infrastructure are evidence that he has no genuine interest in negotiation or meaningful diplomacy. Instead, he is trying to break Ukraine's will to fight by bombing and freezing its civilians into submission. But he will not succeed because Ukraine is fighting for its freedom and for the future of its children. And we will do everything in our power to keep hope alive in Ukraine. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, President. And I also thank you, SG Griffith, for your very sobering remarks. Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, in blatant disregard for international law and the UN Charter, has and will continue to have alarming humanitarian consequences. Russia's warfare has killed and maimed civilians, including children, destroyed homes, hospitals, and schools. Their cynical destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including yesterday's missile strikes, is already causing significant suffering and has the potential for further catastrophic consequences as winter deepens. Children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly are in a particular vulnerable situation. Attacks on schools and other educational institutions are clearly in contradiction of Security Council Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in conflict, a resolution Russia voted in favor of and which was unanimously adopted by this Council. These attacks are also constitute violations of international humanitarian law. They must stop. Children and other civilians must be protected. President, Russia's war has led to massive displacement. We are concerned about the risk of sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking that displaced people, in particular women and unaccompanied children, are exposed to. Thousands of Ukrainian children have reportedly been transferred to Russia for adoption and neutralization through simplified and accelerated procedures without the consent of their parents or legal guardians. We strongly condemn this inhumane practice. Nevertheless, throughout this war, the Ukrainian people have shown great bravery and resilience. We commend communities, local responders, and humanitarian organizations that continue to serve people in need. We reiterate our call for safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need, and underline the importance of putting children's need at the center of the humanitarian response. President, numerous reports already point to widespread violation of international humanitarian law committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, many possible at the level of war crimes. Individuals at all levels must be held to account. We are alarmed by the Russian Federation's use of Wagner Group as part of its warfare. They are accused of committing numerous violations of international humanitarian law, including torture, rape, and looting. Now, Wagner are reportedly recruiting convicted criminals from prisons in Russia to fight in Ukraine. We are concerned that soldiers with this background are a particular risk to the civilian population. President, the Secretary General added Ukraine as a situation of concern with immediate effect to his annual report to the Security Council on children in armed conflict. We welcome the engagement of the SRSG for children in armed conflict with all parties to the conflict. Child protection issues must urgently be addressed, including the prevention of violations against children. And we call on all relevant actors to support and facilitate the work of the SRSG. Russia's war has also aggravated a global food and energy crisis. It affects the life and futures of children and families in many regions dramatically. We welcome the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the efforts of the Secretary General to facilitate availability of food and fertilizers to world market. President, let me end by reiterating that Ukraine can count on Norway's continued support, and we welcome President Zelensky's Peace Formula initiative. Russia must stop the war and fully, immediately, and unconditionally withdraw its forces and military equipment from Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you. Madam President, I thank USG Martin Griffiths for his briefing. We remain concerned by the persisting humanitarian suffering in Ukraine. It is shocking statistic that estimated 40% of Ukraine's power generation capacity has been damaged or destroyed by direct attacks. This means that the country's energy infrastructure will not meet the needs of civilians in the coming winter season, no doubt sharply increasing their suffering. We condemn all attacks on civilian infrastructure, and in particular, water and power infrastructure. We also note and condemn attacks on residential buildings and other civilian objects. Our repeated calls for a cessation of hostilities and dialogue leading to a mediated settlement has not been heeded. Indeed, the strategic considerations by all combatants and their allies indicate that their continuing resistance to negotiation. If this persists, then we must insist on minimizing the harm to civilians by all actors agreeing to a humanitarian exception. We welcome the recent agreement by all parties to roll over the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We also applaud the efforts by the Secretary General to remove obstacles to exporting food and fertilizers, including those from the Russian Federation. This initiative, anchored by Turkey and the UN, is the clearest example of the humanitarian exception. Madam President, the humanitarian consequences of this war are not limited to Ukraine. Our own food security in Africa has deteriorated and may get worse if fertilizer costs remain high due to the war. The fact is that since March, the transit and transshipment in ports of Russian fertilizers and the raw materials through nearby countries have fallen by 90%. Overall, Russian fertilizer supplies to world markets have decreased sharply, leading to the rise in prices. The consequences are being felt in families' dining tables as farmers pass their higher costs and grow less food. The challenges will grow as the strategic grain reserves of several wealthy countries run low. They will probably return to the food markets to restock next year or in 2024, at a time when African farmers may still be struggling to afford fertilizer. The food prices in such a scenario will rise up sharply, that widespread humanitarian suffering will be the result. We can recall the violent uprisings in 2011, which were credibly linked to high food prices. Similar ones may occur in the next few years, with results similar to the spread of terrorism that followed the political turmoil in 2011. In other words, higher fertilizer prices leading to further insecurity and poverty may manifest as threat to regional and international peace and security. We therefore urge the Secretary General, the World Food Programme, and related institutions to link food and security. If they do so, they will realize the need to redouble their efforts to comprehensively open up the flow of phosphates, ammonia, and other fertilizer components. The clearest metric of success is a return to the production levels prior to the war. There must also be more feasible action against the fear of sanctions exposure by the banking and insurance industries in dealing with food and fertilizer supply chains. Countries through which these goods are shipped must remove all official and official blockading actions to reflect their humanitarian responsibility. Madam President, of course, the most humanitarian action is for the military attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity to stop. As long as the war persists, it can easily escalate to the use of weapons of mass destruction. Such an escalation would no doubt further increase the suffering of Ukrainians and hundreds of millions of other people around the world. It is time for responsible leadership that has an appetite for prevention and mitigation of the risk of escalation. Such leadership will embrace discreet and even secret diplomatic channels. It will act on the understanding that peace in Europe requires a fundamental reset of European security order. It will know the limits of using military means to rebuild the order, given the risks of escalation. It will have the political courage to pursue practical strategic outcomes for security and stability. Given the evidence since March, the Security Council will only endorse and give further legality to agreements reached. While waiting for such a welcome development, the Council must redouble its attention to the humanitarian situation arising from the war. Reports by the Secretariat need to inform the Council of humanitarian impacts, not only in Ukraine, but globally in regard to food and energy security. If the blockages continue, then the Council should pass a resolution that all countries remove all barriers to the export and shipment of food and fertilizer products as a key to the prevention of insecurity and threats to international peace. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, as a topic for today's meeting, it's Western initiators said the situation regarding children. If we leave to one side the fairy tales about the fate of Ukrainian children and the insinuations as to what Russia is supposedly doing to them, the fact that our Western colleagues are paying attention to this is, of course, good. But if you are claiming to be objective, then we need to talk about the primary reason for the crisis, the years-long crimes by Ukraine regarding civilians and children in Donbass. This is something that the West is shamefully trying to hide. If you look and even talk about this in the media, then you can be stripped of your career. It's much easier just to stay silent. Otherwise, the humanitarian nature of the Kiev regime falls apart. This is why in the English version of Wikipedia recently a page on the Alley of Angels was deleted. It is a memorial in Donetsk to the memory of children who died during the war by Kiev against Donbass. Why should you worry a Western reader? Because then he might raise some not nice questions. The Western reader would have to know, therefore, that since 2014, Ukrainian shots and shelling in Donbass have killed more than 250 children, 140 of whom were killed from the beginning of 2022. Unfortunately, the list of those killed and injured as a result of shelling by the Ukrainian army has been filled with new names, including children's names. The Ukrainian army is firing on peaceful civilians in Donbass, and this is ongoing. How Western colleagues, however, shamefully are trying to hide this. They also ignore the fact that while children in Donbass are the target practice for Ukrainian neo-Nazis, then their own children over the past 8 years have been the target audience for poisonous neo-Nazi and Russia-phobic propaganda. There are lots of examples on the internet of teaching children, participating in torchlight processions and training them in military camps and imbuing them with blatant Russophobia and anti-Semitism. As a result, in Ukraine, a whole generation of children and adolescents have grown up with a warped psychology. They think their aim is to kill everybody who speaks Russian. A good example of this was the internet photo of Father Frost, Ded Moroz, who's like Santa Claus, with a request for presents from two boys, one from Donetsk and one Ukrainian. The child from Donetsk, who was born and raised there under the shelling, asked for one thing, that the shelling would stop. The Ukrainian boy asked for a machine gun so that he could kill Russians and set the Kremlin on fire. The words of children, as we know, reflect the values and the thinking of the whole of society. So you can make your own conclusions here. In the context of upholding the rights of children in Ukraine, we mustn't avoid the activities of the notorious peacekeeping or Mirotvorets site, where the neo-nationalists are posting personal data of enemies of Ukraine, including those of children. And people on there can be subject to persecution and trauma, often physical harm. For example, we see what happened with the Russian journalist Daria Dugina. So look what has happened. There's this criminal resource and personal data of 327 children was put on there. When this became clear, we swiftly in July informed the UNSC and the executive director of UNICEF about it. We'd like to put a question today. What did UNICEF do since it received our request? And what does it think about the publication of personal data of children on the internet? Is there any reaction to this from the Ukrainian authorities? Madam Chair, during the meeting on the Ukrainian crisis in the General Assembly, we recorded interest from a significant majority of member states to have diplomatic settlement of the situation in Ukraine. We are reacting to this very seriously. We confirm our willingness to conduct negotiations. The aim would be to eradicate the root causes that forced us to start our special military operation, our SMO, in Ukraine. This logica is something is being welcomed with understanding by most states apart from the collective West and the Kiev regime. Despite the clear military realities on the ground, there is another logic. The military actions must lead to the defeat of Russia. Therefore, what you're seeing now is an ongoing war of the West against Russia until the last Ukrainian. This is something that leaves us no other option but to continue the aims of our SMO militarily. The Ukrainian people are suffering from this. They're being used by the West and the criminal Ukrainian regime as cannon fodder. The fact that the West is not interested in a political diplomatic settlement of the Ukrainian crisis has been confirmed by the results of the NATO Council meeting on the 29th and 30th of November in Bucharest. By expanding deliveries of weapons to Kiev, the West is confirming its desire not only to have a further escalation of the conflict, but to destabilize the situation in Europe as a whole. It is now becoming clear that the uncontrolled pumping of weapons to the Kiev regime is becoming a global problem, without having an actual impact on the situation on the ground. There is much evidence that Western weapons earmarked for Ukraine are increasingly falling into the hands of bandits and terrorists of different stripes, not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East and Africa. The president of Nigeria, Mohamed Buhari, confirmed that the conflict in Ukraine is the main source of weapons for terrorists in the Lake Chad Basin. Transnational criminal groups are engaged in contraband and money laundering, and clearly there is involvement in these criminal schemes of officials from those countries that are sending weapons. This problem creates a real threat to international peace and security and really deserves the focus of the Council. Therefore, we are asking the Indian presidency to convene on this a separate meeting of the Security Council on Friday, the 9th of December. Using strange logic, Western countries promise to continue supplying arms to Ukraine as long as needed, claiming that they're doing this for the sake of peace. The EU, for example, is even financing these supplies through the European Peace Facility, clearly to confuse their own taxpayers. However, Kiev has its own response to why exactly they need so many weapons. The Secretary of the Ukrainian Security Council, Alexei Danilov, said recently that the weapons are needed in Ukraine because Russians just need to be destroyed so that they stop existing as a country. And that is a quote. Sitting around a negotiating table with Moscow, as Mr. Danilov said, is something that is not dignified for the Ukrainian people. I think there's no need to explain that we cannot fail to react to such hateful rhetoric by Kiev. We have to counter this heinous actions, including by conducting strikes on infrastructure that are used for military supplies, for logistics, and communications for the Ukrainian armed formations. In other words, we will weaken the military capacity of the Zelensky regime. These facilities are being incapacitated by precision strikes. Civilian infrastructure in Ukrainian towns would not suffer if they were not placed, if they had not placed a Ukrainian air defense system in residential areas. And for some reason, these strikes are being blamed on Russia. Russia is targeting civilian facilities. The fact that a Ukrainian missile landed in Poland and yesterday in Moldova demonstrates the danger of the Ukrainian army using weapons, not only to their citizens, but also to their neighboring countries. Incidentally, it wasn't us who came up with the idea that energy and transport infrastructure is a part of the military capacity of a state. Western countries who are accusing Russia of deliberately striking civilians seem to forget that they targeted civilians in Yugoslavia during the 1990s. We have Jamie Shea, the press secretary of NATO, on the 25th of May 1999, who said the following, and I quote, there was a Q&A with the official representatives of NATO. The question was, if you say that the Yugoslavian army has many generators, then why are you depriving the country of 70% not only of electricity, but also of water supplies? Because apparently NATO is striking military facilities. This was the response. Unfortunately, the command and control system also depends on energy. If Milosevic really wants his civilians to have water and electricity, then he knows what he has to do. He has to accept NATO conditions, and we will stop this campaign. Until he does this, we will continue to attack targets that supply his army with electricity. If this has an impact on the population, then that is his, in other words, Milosevic's problem. Thus, NATO, some 20 years ago, stated its position regarding the significance of strikes on civilian infrastructure for the defense capability of a state. However, today, different standards are being used for Ukraine than those that were used for Serbia in the 1990s. Madam Chair, by breaking the military backbone of the Kiev regime, we believe that its policy and its next steps will leave no doubt as to its criminal, hate-filled nature. Apart from the fact that there is ongoing cleaning up of the political scenario, and this is something that is happening in front of the eyes of Western colleagues and with their tacit consent, the Ukrainian leadership is continuing to combat religious people and those who think differently. There was this mocking decision on the prohibition of activities of religious centers that apparently are affiliated with the Russian state. And this basically is a ban on freedom of religion. And this is a key rule in a democratic state. And this is lauded by the Kiev regime. In the Orthodox beliefs, something that is sacred both for Russians and for Ukrainian believers is the Uspensky Kiev Pechersky Monastery. So what's going to come after that? A ban on praying, or it's already happened, a ban on praying in Russian. In the social media, it says that there are statements made in churches that if you pray in Russian, then your prayers will not be heard, and that those who prayed will be afflicted with ills and pain. This is an excellent illustration of how low the Ukraine is prepared to stoop today. Our Western colleagues, for an 8-year period, have created an anti-Russian monster in Ukraine. They have closed their eyes to the horrors of the crimes against their own people, murders of civilians in Donbass, and the glorification of Nazi crimes and their acolytes, persecution against Russian speakers in their own country. The Kiev regime has done all it could to fulminate against Russia, and thinking it would become an instrument in the geopolitical fight of the US and its allies, and NATO and Russia. Therein lies the criticism that it levels against our country. This criticism does not, and this harshness does not surprise us and does not stop us, and we will continue the aims of the SMO. If the aims of it cannot be achieved peacefully, cannot turn Ukraine into a normal, good neighborly loving state, from where comes a threat against Russia, then this aim will be achieved militarily. The responsibility for the fact that the vassals of in the West are harming the civilians, the responsibility for this has to be borne by the Zelensky regime and his Western sponsors, who say that they absolutely want to defeat Russia. That is their choice, not ours. And until Kiev and the West understands this and sees this, we will protect our interests with all means available to us, all legitimate military means. In conclusion, Madam President, I'd like to say that I'm not going to listen to what is going to be said by the representative of the Kiev regime. He tweeted very recently about this. Those people who do not know his creative acts, I thoroughly recommend that you should read them. As we already said, this really shows the high level of Ukrainian diplomacy. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Martin, for your very stark briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and indeed across the globe. Ukraine saw this season's first falls of snow in November. This was just days after Russia launched new attacks on energy infrastructure and caused widespread blackouts across the country. Now, at the start of December, these attacks have continued as the harsh cold winter we feared is beginning to set in. It brings with it new dimensions to the humanitarian crisis caused by Russia's war. Rather than herald the beginning of a peaceful and joyful season, this year's winter threatens the lives of millions of men, women and children across Ukraine. Millions of civilians who are forced to endure plummeting temperatures without the basic necessities of heat, food or light. Ireland strongly condemns the attacks by the Russian Federation on critical civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. We do so in the strongest possible terms. We recall yet again basic principles of international and humanitarian law which must be respected. These include the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Russia often tells us, and we have heard it again today here, that these attacks have been on military targets or on infrastructure supporting the Ukrainian military. But the images of people living in the dark, queuing for life-sustaining food and huddling together to stay warm tell a very different story. Ireland regrets that the insecurity and obstacles imposed by Russia continue to restrict humanitarian access along the front lines and in areas not under Ukraine's control. These actions are simply inhumane and unacceptable. Madam President, the level of damage or destruction to other civilian infrastructure, including homes, hospitals and schools, creates further challenges this winter and may well provoke a new wave of displacement. Ireland is deeply concerned by reports from UNHCR that this unjustified war has led to 6.9 million internally displaced people in Ukraine and over 7.8 million refugees. These are not merely statistics. Each person has had their life upended. We are talking about children, the elderly, the infirm, those with disabilities, vulnerable people in a situation beyond their control, seeking shelter and safety. As we know from our work in the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict, children in war suffer most, often with life-altering consequences. Millions of children across Ukraine are being robbed of their childhoods and of their futures by this war. Forced to leave their homes and communities, their educational facilities destroyed by Russian missiles, their right to education denied. This will have profound impacts on their development, but also on society as a whole. The reverberations of this war reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. They will also reach beyond this generation of children in Ukraine. Madam President, a new wave of displacement would exacerbate concerns for the protection of women and children, who we know are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, sexual exploitation and abuse, as highlighted by USG Griffiths earlier today. As this Council has heard before from SRSG Patton, conflict-related sexual violence, including mass rape and the rape of children, has been a consistent feature of this war. But rape is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It is an act that may constitute a war crime and which leaves victims and their communities with lifelong effects and trauma. Ireland strongly supports SRSG's Patton's calls for swift and rigorous investigations to ensure accountability as a central pillar of deterrence, prevention and non-repetition. Because, as she has previously told us here, the failure to acknowledge and investigate such crimes is the surest sign that violations will continue unabated. I conclude, Madam President, as I always do in our discussions on Ukraine, in the unfailing demand that Russia cease and stop this senseless war. Russia is the sole party that has brought war, terror and conflict and hunger to the people of Ukraine since its illegal invasion in February. I speak to Russia directly, therefore, when I say that it is never too late for dialogue and diplomacy. Ireland, therefore, renews our calls on Russia to immediately cease hostilities, withdraw its forces, and commit to resolving all outstanding issues peacefully and in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank Ireland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
I'd like to thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths for his sobering briefing on the situation in Ukraine. Over the course of the past few weeks, the humanitarian community has focused its attention on addressing the impact of winter in Ukraine. As the cold weather sets in, we're seeing humanitarian actors rise to the occasion in support of those most in need. As we heard again today, the situation remains critical, especially in areas that have experienced or continue to experience heavy fighting and shelling. In places like Mykolaiv and Kherson, the lack of electricity, running water, and heating, in addition to the scarcity of food and medicine, is putting considerable pressure on humanitarian response efforts. We not only commend the work of the UN and other major aid organizations, but also of local first responders and community organizations who are deploying innovative measures to address the ever-growing needs, whether through allocating generators, setting up mobile heating and charging stations, or urgently repairing electricity grids and damaged water systems. Winter also brings new and unforeseen dangers. Landmines and unexploded munitions are now concealed by snow and ice. We're deeply concerned by reports that the lack of heating has driven people, including children, to gather firewood in forests littered with hidden explosives. Madam President, the last time the Council met to discuss the situation of children in Ukraine was at the start of the school year in September. Beyond the importance of education itself and avoiding a lost generation of students that are denied opportunity, schooling provides an important source of stability and peer bonding that children desperately need as they cope with the intense trauma of the war. Since September, it is estimated that approximately 2.6 million children in Ukraine are learning online due to the impacts of war on education. Yet even this remote access to education has been disrupted by blackouts and emergency power cuts resulting from the conflict's impact on energy infrastructure. We reiterate our call to take all necessary measures to prevent the targeting of civilian infrastructure and to ensure that all children can safely access education. Children must be protected from the worst impacts of armed conflict. But the war's impact on the children of Ukraine goes beyond the immediate threat to physical safety. The psychosocial impacts of the conflict could engender long-term challenges that affect an entire generation of children. When families are separated and forced to move or take shelter underground, their daily activities are severely disrupted and the mental health of children suffers. We applaud those working on the ground, particularly community organizations that have mobilized to provide psychosocial support to children impacted by the war. We can and must do more to protect the children of Ukraine. At the same time, it is critical to ensure that children elsewhere in the world do not suffer from the impact of the global food crisis that has been exacerbated by this war. We were heartened to see the FAO's latest global food price index, which showed a modest decrease in global food prices, due in part to the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Yet we're still seeing record high levels of food prices, which impact the poorest countries first. Areas in which fertilizer is not available face low harvests that could undermine even the limited progress made in lowering food prices. In this regard, we welcome the donation of 260,000 metric tons of Russian fertilizer and the news of the first shipment that is destined for Malawi. We look forward to further shipments in the coming months, as well as other efforts to enhance fertilizer supply. At the same time, we continue to underline the need to ensure that the delivery of grain facilitated by the July Istanbul agreements reaches those most in need. In this respect, we further welcome the recent arrival of Ukrainian wheat bound for Ethiopia. We must all engage in collective efforts to ensure children do not go hungry, whether in Ukraine or in other parts of the world. Once again, we reiterate the need for de-escalation and a diplomatic solution to this crisis. For its part, the Council needs to encourage dialogue and foster an environment that is conducive to a cessation of hostilities in order to ultimately bring an end to the fighting. The UAE continues to stand ready to deploy its good offices and contribute to efforts aimed at achieving these goals. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank USG Mr. Martin Griffiths for his briefing. The Security Council is convening once again in close succession on account of the humanitarian crisis resulting from the unrelenting military bombardments on civilian populated areas in Ukraine. Despite the several calls of the Council for the protection of civilians, the war in Ukraine continues to unfold with the devastating impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure critical to the survival and livelihoods of the people. The ordinary people of Ukraine continue to suffer attacks in blatant violation of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. We continue to be deeply concerned by military hostilities across several front lines, especially the new wave of missile attacks which began yesterday and which reportedly have claimed some civilian lives. We are concerned that these attacks are happening at a critical time when temperatures are dropping and many homes are already without access to heating or water, further worsening the humanitarian conditions of the people. We are particularly disheartened by the plight of Ukrainian children whose childhood have been upended by the war. It is not only unfortunate but unacceptable that children anywhere should suffer from the vials of armed conflict. Thousands of Ukrainian children have either been killed, maimed, or displaced to unfamiliar environments as a result of the war. The physical and psychological well-being of these children are under constant threat from the persistent violence, disruptions to their education, and in some cases, sexual abuse and violations. We register our strong condemnation of all forms of violations against the rights of children and strongly support investigations into such cases to avoid impunity against children in Ukraine. We further welcome the differentiated humanitarian assistance that would ensure that specific needs, especially psychosocial health and nutritional needs of the children, will be catered to. We urge international support for the restoration of Ukraine's energy and water supply infrastructure, which have been damaged or destroyed, and hope that the international conference announced by the French government to be held in Paris on 13 December would help to mobilize resources to augment the efforts of the United Nations humanitarian agencies and further enhance resilience in Ukraine. The scaling up of humanitarian assistance, especially the provision of winterization support, is important. However, as we have indicated in our previous statements to the Council, such measures are insufficient to assuage the full impact of the war. The war must end, and it must end now to prevent further debilitating humanitarian conditions. Madam President, at the founding of the United Nations, World leaders, having witnessed the ugliness of the two previous world wars on our common humanity, pledged to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. While a third world war has been kept at bay, the war in Ukraine has had far-reaching global consequences. We, who now bear the responsibility of promoting international peace and security, must therefore intensify our efforts to bring an end to the war on Ukraine, and indeed all other conflict situations around the world. The war in Ukraine, in our view, has come at a cost to the world and is an expense we cannot continue to afford. We must therefore continue in our efforts to bring the parties to the negotiating table to chart a political process and a peaceful settlement of the conflict through the channels of dialogue and diplomacy. We welcome reports on the progress being made to resume ammonia exports through the Black Sea port. The unimpeded exports of Ukrainian grain and Russian fertilizers are respectively critical to avoid a rebound in global food price increases and avert a food shortage in the coming months. We reiterate our call for an end to the hostilities and call on the Russian Federation to end its aggression against Ukraine. The immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine would provide a much-needed window for diplomatic consultations towards a peaceful and comprehensive settlement of the conflict that lies between the two countries. We reiterate further our call on the warring sides to take necessary measures to protect civilians from harm and avoid the targeted attacks of Ukraine's energy and other critical infrastructure. There is also a continued need to address concerns of nuclear safety. In bringing my statement to a close, I reiterate Ghana's unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We continue to solidarize with the people of Ukraine in these perilous times and reaffirm our support for all international efforts to restore peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, USG Griffiths, for the updated information. We commend the monumental work and commitment of OCHA to Ukraine and its people, and we understand the uneasiness to have to bring the never-ending misery of the war to the Council. Colleagues, yesterday was the 28th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum, a landmark agreement according to which Ukraine delivered its nuclear arsenal, and in exchange, the Russian Federation committed to respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. There were no festivities, no parades in Kiev or in Moscow. The only celebration was the latest barrage of deadly missiles, the fifth of the kind against Ukraine coming from the east, its neighbor and aggressor, Russia, in a continued effort to cripple Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It was yet another attempt to plunge Ukraine into darkness and cold, to punish innocent civilians, to disrupt power and water supplies amid freezing temperatures by weaponizing winter. We hear that Russia does not target civilians. The truth is that the only civilians not under attack are those 17,000 already killed. Colleagues, since February, we have heard many times the Kremlin claim that its special operation, which has now entered the 10th month, everything is going to plan. But we never got a real chance to know what the plan exactly was, as it kept changing. A 3-day walk into Ukraine, take Kiev and overthrow the government? It failed. To wipe Ukraine from the world map? It nosedived before even it started. To break the morale of an entire nation and force it into submission? The contrary has happened. The reality is that despite despicable crimes and widespread human rights abuses, despite continued vicious attacks on civilian infrastructure and continued efforts to bring the war into every Ukrainian household, the aggression has spectacularly failed to break Ukraine. It has only boosted Ukraine's resistance and its national identity. Also internationally, the false narrative on Ukraine has not been able to poison the desire for truth and peace. Only a few weeks ago, 143 members said a resounding no to annexation of territory by force, an unquestionable no to a world according to Kremlin. Madam President, as we heard, the situation of children is particularly worrying. Nearly 6 million of them have been affected since the start of the war. Many cannot attend schools because they have been damaged or demolished, and power cuts are disrupting online classes. Some 3.4 million Ukrainians need child protection care, and many, and USG Griffiths mentioned 700,000, are enduring injuries and psychological trauma. For them, the scars are deep and lasting. For them, the war has brought loss of education, loss of health care, loss of a place to grow up healthy. Needless to remind that this war continues to take a heavy toll on civilians. And again, I will quote USG Griffiths, who said everything in one sentence: destruction, death, displacement caused by a senseless war. That is what civilians are enduring there. We commend the efforts of the UN system and humanitarian partners delivering critical assistance and ensuring protection across the country. Madam President, deliberate destruction or damage of civilian objects such as schools, hospitals, energy and water infrastructure is a violation of international humanitarian law. Our own Security Council resolution 2573, adopted only last year, strongly condemns attacks in situations of armed conflicts directed against civilians and other protected persons that deprive them of objects indispensable of their survival. And indeed, energy, water, heat are indispensable for survival, even more so during wintertime. Those who authorize such flagrant violations in Ukraine are not only acting in contradiction with commitments and obligations, they are committing crimes. And there is a soaring evidence of war crimes committed against the civilian population by Russian forces, indiscriminate attacks, torture, and sexual and gender-based violence, including against prisoners. They are documented, must be investigated, and the perpetrators held accountable. We could not prevent the war. We must make sure there is accountability. Colleagues, it is clear that the cause of this enduring suffering, including its humanitarian aspect, food insecurity, and its worldwide impact, lies in the war of choice in Ukraine. We know how the war started. We do not know how and when it will end. But we know that the only way to stop this madness is by immediately and unconditionally withdraw all forces and military equipment for the entire territory of Ukraine, respect its internationally recognized borders, and embrace diplomacy. Yes, dialogue, but dialogue in freedom, not under coercion. Until then, Ukraine needs, has, and will have our support, because supporting Ukraine is supporting everything we stand for. And I thank you.
I thank Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Under-Secretary General Griffiths, for your briefing. Death, destruction, displacement, and suffering, you said. President, this is the third time in as many weeks that we have discussed Russia's brutal attacks on civilians across Ukraine. On all three occasions, the UN has underlined the devastating humanitarian impact of the systematic strikes on Ukraine's critical infrastructure and civilian centers. This presents a potentially catastrophic situation for Ukraine's brave and courageous people and for the 690 organizations who are supporting the humanitarian need as winter begins and people are left without water, power, and shelter. We know what Russia is trying to do. It is trying to bring terror and suffering to the civilian population in a war of subjugation. It is barbaric, illegal, and horribly cruel. The statistics we've heard from the UN today are shocking. More than 17,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine by Russia's senseless war. It's a devastating number of innocent lives lost. And we've heard today in particular about the impact Russia's war is having on children in Ukraine. The millions forced to flee their homes and in need of humanitarian assistance. The hundreds killed, injured, or missing. The damage or destruction of over 500 schools, and in those that remain, classes interrupted by air raid sirens and power cuts. The reports that thousands of children have been forcibly taken to Russia, and the credible allegations of sexual violence against children by Russian forces. The trauma inflicted by Russia will last for generations. President, the response from this Council and the wider UN membership has been consistent. A call for an end to conflict, for peace. President Zelensky again asked us 2 weeks ago to help end the suffering of Ukrainian people and expressed his willingness to negotiate a peace based on the principles of the UN Charter. But Russia is not listening. In response, has been wave after wave of long-range strikes and continued, albeit frustrated, efforts to take Ukrainian territory. It is time for Russia to end this war, to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and commit to dialogue and negotiations based on international law and the UN Charter. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the United Kingdom for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of India. May I begin by thanking Martin Griffiths for his briefing on the situation in Ukraine with regard to the protection of civilians and the situation of children. India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in a loss of lives and countless miseries for its people, particularly for women, children, and the elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in recent weeks is indeed deeply worrying. We reiterate our grave concerns in this regard. Children constitute a third of humanity, the most important third, as they are our future. They are also the most vulnerable to suffering, particularly in situations of armed conflict, and therefore need additional protection and care. The conflict in Ukraine is without a doubt severely impacting the 7.5 million children across the country. While the protection of the rights of the child, including their access to education, is the primary responsibility of the national government, the international community has the obligation to do its utmost to provide succor to children affected by the conflict. India is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and appreciative of the ongoing efforts, including that of UNICEF, to alleviate the sufferings of the children. We also support UNICEF efforts to scale up its operations. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, and as the Council is aware, India has consistently called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to the violence. We've called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue, and also expressed our support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. We believe that no solution can be arrived at the cost of human lives. Our Prime Minister has spoken to the presidents of Ukraine and Russia on multiple occasions and reiterated India's position. India stands ready to support all such efforts aimed at de-escalation. I should also wish to point out that the impact of the Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe. The conflict is exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. it is necessary for all of us to appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility on these critical issues for the Global South. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. On our part, we are providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the Global South under economic distress. To help low-income countries fight against price rise and shortage of foodstuff, India has exported more than 1.8 million tons of wheat to countries in need, including to Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, and Yemen. We hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the call for humanitarian assistance. India has so far dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and at the request of the Ukrainian government, India has also provided financial aid for reconstruction of an educational institution. We stand ready to do more. Let us not forget that the situation has also affected foreign students, including those from India. India facilitated the safe return of 22,500 Indian nationals, most of them students studying in various universities in Ukraine. Even as we are currently exploring options to minimize the impact on our students' education, we appreciate the relaxations made by the Ukrainian government for this academic year in respect of medical students. In conclusion, allow me to reiterate that the global order is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. I now resume my duties as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Griffiths, I also recognize here what has left of the representatives of terrorist Moscow regime in the permanent state of the Soviet Union. Today, on Ukrainian Armed Forces Day, I salute Ukraine's heroic and invincible soldiers fighting for their country, for their families, and for every one of us, and for our free future. The aggressor will be defeated, the dictatorship will fail, and the war criminals will be held to account. It is yet another meeting in which these representatives of the Russian Federation try to convince the Council of their country's readiness for peace. And the hypocrisy of their words has again been revealed by the deeds of their country on the ground. Yesterday, Ukraine sustained another wave of Russian missile terror. More than 70 missiles were launched from aircraft and ships to hit critical infrastructure throughout Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces were able to intercept almost 60 of these missiles. We are grateful to the responsible nations throughout the world that contribute to enhancing Ukraine's air defense and thus to saving the lives of innocent civilians. Given the reports on missile fragments being found in Moldova following yesterday's strike by Russia, we reiterate that Russian missile terror poses a dangerous threat not only to Ukraine but to the neighboring countries as well. The only way to prevent the spillover effect is to continue supporting Ukraine by further strengthening our air defense and missile defense capacities. We also welcome in this regard the readiness of our friends to ensure immediate assistance to Ukrainians in meeting their urgent needs and in strengthening the civilian resilience of the Ukrainian people following Russian terrorist attacks on our infrastructure. The international conference Standing with Ukrainian People, organized by France and Ukraine in Paris on December 13 serves as a good example of such efforts. We encourage the UN member states and the leadership of the UN Secretariat to participate at that event. Madam President, it speaks volumes that Moscow decided to attack Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and its people on the anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum. On December the 5th, 1994, in Budapest, the Kremlin granted security assurances to Ukraine, committing in particular to respect Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and the existing borders, and reaffirming that none of its weapons, I quote, will ever be used against Ukraine. Almost every single day, Russia demonstrates that its assurances are of no worth, be it those that Moscow gave in the past, or those they speak about now, or those they may offer in the future. Indeed, sometimes the Kremlin might seem to take an adequate position, as the then President Yeltsin did. In his letter to President Clinton, dated November 2, 1994, Yeltsin conveyed his readiness, and I quote, "to make a decision now with regard to signing a document on guarantees," and expressed his confidence that, I quote, "the leaders' signatures should seal a really milestone document which would cover all the concerns of Ukraine, which is fraternal to us," end of quote. The problem is that the post-Soviet transformation in Russia was not underpinned by decommunization and the dismantling of the authoritarian style of leadership, and thus led to Putinism instead of democracy. The lessons of history must be learned, this time in order not to let the tragedies be repeated again. After the military defeat of Russia, which is imminent, the deputinization and denuclearization of this country must follow. By marking the anniversary of Budapest with a missile strike on Ukraine, the Kremlin finally showed it has no moral or legal grounds for possessing nuclear weapons. It means that while the armed forces of Ukraine continue to do their job to defeat Russia militarily, the international community must start considering the modalities of post-Putin arrangements with Moscow, arrangements that should include a new Budapest Memorandum to be signed by Moscow in the context of its denuclearization. It is still to be seen how soon after its military defeat and by whom this document could be signed on behalf of the territory with administrative center in Moscow. Such an arrangement would require credible counterparts, and neither Putin nor any of his cronies can be considered trustworthy. Distinguished colleagues, Ukraine needs peace and Ukraine wants peace more than any other country. It is our territory that has been invaded. It is our people that are being killed. It's our homes that are being destroyed and robbed by the Russian army. Please keep this in mind every time Moscow attempts to wear sheep's clothing and to persuade us that it is not the aggressor, but the victim who resists peace efforts. Ukraine indeed resists, not peace, of course. We resist Moscow attempts to erase us from the map. We also resist the Russian strategy of buying time and under the guise of peace efforts to replenish its military arsenal, to build strongholds in the occupied territories, and to prepare for a new attack, be it in 2 or 5 or 7 years. Putin's representative here tells us about peace, but his masters in Moscow at the same time claim that Russia will not leave the territory of Ukraine. In a nutshell, the so-called peace a la Kremlin would be built upon violations of the UN Charter. Madam President, Moscow's vision of peace means as well that all Ukrainians in the occupied territories would be left in danger, unprotected from abduction, detention, torture, looting, and execution-style killing. In all Ukrainian territories still under Russian control, the occupation authorities regard any local resident as a potential enemy. That is why, while retreating, Russian troops leave behind mass graves and torture chambers. This was the case in Kyiv and the northern regions in April, in Kharkiv region in September, and in Kherson last month. At the end of November, Ukrainian law enforcement exhumed a mass grave in the liberated village of Pravdine, Kherson region. According to eyewitness accounts, in April, occupiers killed 7 people, including a teenage girl, in a private house, which they then blew up. Local residents were forbidden to bury the remains for a long time. Another episode of the Russian war of aggression. 7 more human lives taken for nothing. Several days ago, a DNA examination confirmed that one of the bodies found in the mass grave in Izum, Kharkiv region, belonged to a well-known Ukrainian children's writer, Volodymyr Vakulenko. His village near Izum was occupied at the very beginning of the invasion, and he stayed there because of his son diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. A peaceful civilian whose only guilt in the eyes of Russians was his affiliation with Ukrainian literature. And that was enough for them to detain Mr. Vakulenko at the end of March and to kill him. The teenager son of the Ukrainian writer will live with memories of his father as one of the heroes. He will read his father's books, and they will warm up his heart. Let me ask the Russian diplomats in this chamber, or what left of them, what legacy will you leave to your children? The volumes of lies and shameful attempts to whitewash war crimes and genocide was a torturous and painful life you leave to your children. Distinguished colleagues, we remain concerned over the vile practice of family separations and mass deportations of children from the occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. To date, the Ukrainian authorities have identified 12,340 children deported to Russia or the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia. Up to now, only 119 deported children have been returned to their relatives in Ukraine. We urge Moscow to cease this illegal practice and to immediately provide the relevant UN bodies and international organizations with full information on Ukraine's children abducted or deported to its territory, including those children who were subsequently adopted or transferred to foster families. We call on the UN authorities, as well as the international community, not to be silent about these crimes and demand Russia to provide access to these children and facilitate their safe return and family reunification in line with the best interests of the child and in accordance with international law. Madam President, back in November, we informed the Security Council of the peace formula plan proposed by President Zelensky. It includes 10 steps that would lead us all to a sustainable and lasting peace. Let me remind you that the list includes radiation and nuclear safety, food security, energy security, release of all prisoners and deportees, restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity according to the UN Charter, withdrawal of Russian troops, justice, preventing ecocide, preventing escalation and legal confirmation of the end of war. I'm grateful to those members of the Security Council that have emphasized the viability of this plan. We invite UN member states to take leadership or participate in any of the 10 points of the plan. It is time to start its implementation. I have listened carefully to the intervention of the representative of Kenya, and especially the point of issue, and especially on the issue of food security. Let me say it loud and clear. The root cause, the only root cause of this problem is the Russian war on Ukraine. And as soon as the war is stopped, 99% of the issues you raised will be removed. Therefore, another important development I would like to dwell on is the fact that the past week was a start of practical implementation of initiative Grain from Ukraine. As of now, more than 30 countries and the EU declared their financial participation in the humanitarian program Grain from Ukraine initiated by President Zelensky. Pledges has already amounted almost to $190 million US. In the framework of the program on December the 4th, the first ship already delivered 25,000 tons of Ukrainian wheat to Ethiopia to the port of Daralech, Djibouti. Yesterday, another ship set off for Ethiopia loaded with 30,000 tons of wheat. 2 more ships are now being loaded at the seaport of Chernomorsk, and they are due to deliver 60,000 tons of wheat for Somalia and Sudan. In general, within the framework of this important humanitarian initiative, our state is going to send more than 60 ships to Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Congo, Kenya, Yemen, and other countries. As I have already said, more than 30 countries and international organizations have already offered their support to the Grain from Ukraine program. There are 2 reasons why this program is important. First, it destroys the Russian propaganda in the countries of Global South because they see that Russia is a problem while Ukraine is a rescuer. Second, it is the support of Ukrainian agriculture, our farmers, amidst the hardship of war. We continue to work on enlarging the group of countries that support the humanitarian program Grain from Ukraine and increase the scope of financial contributions to this program. Distinguished colleagues, we harbor no illusions about Russian readiness for peace. For the time being, it is a militarized and brainwashed society ruled by war criminals and educated with hatred. As long as they have resources, they will continue to attack Ukraine, global security architecture, and the international order based on the UN Charter. Moscow must be deprived of its ability to produce missiles, to finance military activities in Ukraine, to threaten the world with the saber rattling. We encourage responsible and peace-loving nations to continue seeking relevant opportunities to deprive Moscow of fossil fuel revenues used to finance the war. In this regard, the decision to cap the price of Russian oil is a first step in the right direction, although the upper limit requires further adjustments. It is completely useless to beg Moscow for peace or to appeal to their common sense. Moscow can only be forced into peace, and this is the only language they understand and respond to. As soon as this strategy is applied by all, sustainable peace, as well as the restoration of respectful principles of the UN Charter, will be within reach. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Madam President, I'm speaking on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I thank Under-Secretary Griffiths for his sobering briefing, as well as the Presidency for the opportunity to address the Council. Destroying energy, heat, and water supplies to inflict pain on people who are already suffering food and medicine shortages seems to be a key to Russia's war of terror against the civilian population in Ukraine. Just days after Ukraine saw this season's first snow, Russia's strikes caused widespread blackouts and disruptions of vital services, affecting millions of people, including children. On the onset of winter conditions, we are facing a completely new dimension of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Crisis deliberately created by Russia also has affected neighboring countries. For example, Moldova experienced blackouts as well. During the past few weeks, Russia has only stepped up its indiscriminate attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure. Russia's war in Ukraine has caused immense suffering and psychological trauma, which particularly affects children. Energy cuts have negatively impacted child protection activities. Russia's aggression has left 3.4 million children in need of child protection interventions. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcefully deported to Russia, which constitutes a war crime. Children belong with their families, and they must be safely and immediately returned to their homes. There must not be impunity for Russia's crimes in Ukraine. International community will hold Russia's perpetrators accountable for the crime of aggression and all other atrocity crimes committed in and against Ukraine. Hence, it's imperative to continue documenting and properly storing evidence, as well as reporting regularly on all war crimes committed throughout Ukraine. In order to further strengthen international criminal justice mechanisms, we strongly support the idea to establish a special international tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Currently, there is no international court or tribunal that could bring Russia's top political and military leadership to account for committing those crimes of aggression against Ukraine. The Special International Tribunal for the Punishment of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine has to be established to fill this jurisdictional loophole. Madam President, Russia could, but it does not choose to stop its war of aggression, and all the suffering and crisis it causes to Ukraine and its people, its children. Together with actions directed to stop Russia, one of the international community priorities for this winter should be to ensure protection of the most vulnerable. Shortages of electricity and fuel are adding to the challenges to ensure children in Ukraine can continue their education and receive crucial services. States, civil society organizations, private donors, UN agencies, including UNICEF and other humanitarian partners have worked to meet the needs of millions in dire need of assistance. Additionally, in aiding Ukraine, the Baltic states are leading based on their share of GDP. We commend humanitarians who continue working through challenges imposed by energy shortages to support people in Ukraine. We call upon all relevant UN institutions, as well as the international community, to continue their life-saving efforts. Helping Ukraine to restore its energy infrastructure is especially critical to avoid the direct humanitarian consequences. However, insecurity and obstacles imposed by Russia continue to hinder humanitarian work's capacity to support those in need. The ongoing war in Ukraine severely disrupts access to livelihood opportunities and basic services to women and girls, including life-saving sexual and reproductive health care services. There are mounting allegations of conflict-related sexual violence, including against children, and other forms of gender-based violence. Survivors' access to comprehensive services, including medical and psychological support, needs to be ensured. Madam President, according to NASA Harvest, Ukraine has lost at least 6 million tons, or $1 billion worth of wheat that was harvested in areas controlled by Russia. We would like to reiterate that the Russian aggression is the direct cause of the current global food insecurity, and not the sanctions that are aimed to stop and to end the aggression. We call on Russia to stop prolonging the inspection of vessels heading to and from the Baltic Sea ports, and thereby preventing Ukrainian grain and foodstuffs reaching millions of people. We fully support UN Secretary General's Black Sea Grain Initiative, work of the Joint Coordination Center and UNCTAD in facilitating trade in food and fertilizer to alleviate global food insecurity. We call for transparency in this important work. Unhindered freedom of navigation in the Black Sea is the only practical way to ensure a reliable flow of Ukraine's grain and other food staples. In order to achieve that, Russia must immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Madam President, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will continue to firmly stand up for the UN Charter, international law, human rights, peace, and security. Wherever Russia goes, it leaves horror in its way, and with every passing day, these crimes go unpunished. However, we believe in the power of the international community. We are confident Ukraine will prevail. We are determined that war criminals will be brought to justice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statement, and I now give the floor to Poland.
Madam President, let me start by thanking India for organizing this important briefing, and as well as the USG Martin Griffiths for his insightful yet grim presentation. Madam President, since February 24th, one of the biggest humanitarian crises since the World War II has been unfolding in Poland's immediate neighborhood, Ukraine. It has to be stressed that this crisis is purely man-made, caused solely by the Russian unjustified and unprovoked invasion on Ukraine. This UN Security Council briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is timely, and it takes place within an increasingly challenging context of the humanitarian system. It should be stressed that unlike in most of the conflicts where a humanitarian crisis accompanies the military aggression, in the case of the Russian war against Ukraine, humanitarian crisis is the weapon of war used by the aggressor on purpose. The sole aim of the aggressor at this stage is to create and further deepen the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Such actions by the Russian Federation constitute a war crime and are clearly in blatant disregard of the international law, including the international humanitarian law. This is why today's briefing is indeed timely and pertains to the very essence of the current phase of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Madam President, Poland supports Ukraine since the very beginning of the war in a multidimensional way. Poland's actions are of the threefold character. First, we are hosting and providing support to the biggest community of Ukrainian refugees. Second, we operate as a hub for transferring international humanitarian aid through our border with Ukraine. And third, like other donors, we deliver humanitarian aid directly in Ukraine. With regard to the assistance provided in my country, I should like to point out that the Polish government and at all levels, as well as the civil society, stood up and showed solidarity in the times of need. 77% of Poles have been involved in the various kinds of assistance to Ukraine and to Ukrainians that found refuge in our country. We make every effort to meet the needs of our guests. It should be underlined that we have chosen to provide Ukrainian refugees in Poland with the same public services and the social benefits to which Polish citizens are entitled, including family benefits for children, free public health care and education. Ensuring that children continue their education is one of our top priorities. We are determined to ensure that every child affected by this war can continue their education. Depending on preferences, we offer enrollment in Polish schools or provide equipment necessary for distance learning within the Ukrainian educational system. For those who want to continue their education in Polish schools, preparatory classes are organized to help refugee children to find their way in the Polish educational system and to overcome the language barrier. Currently, there are about 200,000 refugee children from Ukraine in Polish schools, including 35,000 in preschool. Polish Ministry of Education has also created an online platform with various educational tools available for free. The ministry organizes the special language courses for the teachers from Ukraine as well as for the Polish teachers in order to facilitate their communication with children coming from Ukraine and to enable them to better respond to their educational needs. Over 2,500 to 2,500 Polish and Ukrainian teachers have used this training opportunity so far. Poland pays particular attention to the needs of the children with disabilities. Children with special educational needs, as well as their parents, can benefit from psychological and pedagogical assistance in Polish kindergarten and schools. Poland is also delivering humanitarian aid directed in Ukraine. We provide assistance to health sector and to internally displaced Ukrainians by constructing temporary housing towns for 20,000 IDPs at the estimated cost of over 75 million euros, coming from the Polish national budget. Additionally, in the mid-November, 2 mobile medical units were opened, and altogether 12 such units are planned to be opened. In 2022, Poland has also financed humanitarian projects delivered by the NGOs with 2.5 million euros in the areas of food, health, shelter, water, sanitation, hygiene, education, and logistics. According to the OECD preliminary estimates for 2022, Poland will spend on humanitarian assistance approximately 1.5% of the Polish GDP. Madam President, these are very considerable costs, and the needs are growing as we speak. Unfortunately, as long as Russia's deliberate attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure continue, disrupting electricity and heating services and forcing more people to leave their homes in freezing temperatures, the number of persons in urgent need for humanitarian help will grow as well. Poland strongly condemns making use of the harsh winter conditions as a weapon of war against civilians in Ukraine. Poland has been steadfast in our efforts to provide Ukraine with as much support as possible to secure energy supplies for the population suffering from the Russian actions. Polish institutions are in constant contact with the Ukrenergo to coordinate the supply of power generations to Ukraine with the framework of the European network of electricity operators. Madam President, Poland once again strongly urges the Russian Federation to stop its war of choice and respect the international humanitarian law. International law, respect for humanitarian principles, and accountability are core rules to make the humanitarian system reliable for civilians. This is of particular importance for the most defenseless victims of this and any war, the children. Let me end by telling you a few words about the exhibition recently opened by the Polish mission to the United Nations entitled "Mom, I don't want war. Mamo, ja nie хочу wojny," organized thanks to the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Archives, and the Ukrainian partners. It comprised of the 2 incredibly moving testimonies of war, from historical drawings of the Polish children from the 1946, which depict their experiences during the Second World War under the German occupation, and the contemporary drawings of Ukrainian children related to the current war waged on them by Russia. It shows that the war always looks the same through the eyes of the child, and its similarity between the historical and present-day drawings are striking. There is no doubt, unfortunately, that children in Syria, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or any other conflict zone would draw the same images of tanks, bombs, fires, ruined homes, separated families, scenes of fleeing homes. Children see the war and understand the nature of it. We cannot hide the war from children. It traumatizes them as much and sometimes even more than adults. But what is also striking is that children also draw the hope and dreams for the future. So let's hear the message of hope from this booklet of the 7-year-old Ilaria from Zaporizhia in Ukraine. And she wrote under her drawing, "I want peace. I want my family to smile like before. I want to feel the safe sky and the bright, warm sun over my head. I want to go to school. I want to freely give joy and happiness with my violin playing." It is high time to deliver on her very simple hopes and dreams. There is one state in this room that can make it happen, if it chooses to. And the peace plan is on the table, as we heard. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I now give the floor to Germany.
Madam President, thank you, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak in the Council today. It has been over 9 months now since Russia started its full-scale aggression against Ukraine. In recent weeks, Russia has waged its war with ever more systematic attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, far from the front line, with a special focus on disrupting basic services such as electricity, water, and heat during winter. To quote my Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, the Russian president uses the cold as a weapon of war, attacking the most vulnerable in Ukraine. Let me be clear, these attacks are deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure. They are a blatant breach of international humanitarian law. Article 54, second sentence of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention stipulates that, and I quote, "It is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population." The humanitarian impact of these attacks is shocking. Hospitals, schools, water supply stations, residential buildings, etc. are clearly no military targets, but serve civilian needs only. Deliberately and systematically destroying the power supply and heating systems of an entire country in the midst of winter is simply barbaric and inhuman. I urge Russia to stop this cruelty immediately. It is important to coordinate all support for Ukraine's energy infrastructure among international partners and allies. After the successful G7 plus foreign ministers meeting in Bucharest, the summit in Paris on 13th of December will be the next important step. Germany will continue to stand by Ukraine to end this war. Last Friday, Chancellor Scholz spoke with President Putin. He urged the swift withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine as a precondition to any diplomatic solution. Germany welcomes that President Zelensky has articulated his vision for peace in his 10-point peace formula. Germany will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will help Ukraine uphold its resilience. We stand committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. It is Russia that needs to reverse its course and immediately and unconditionally stop its aggression and withdraw its troops. Thank you.
I thank Germany for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And first, I want to congratulate you personally and India for acceding to the presidency of the Security Council. And thank you very much for the invitation to us to speak today at this debate. I speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, but also on behalf of the Republic of Montenegro, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Iceland, Liechtenstein, as well as Andorra and San Marino. I want to thank the briefers, OCHA, for the briefing this morning. And what you have described is a situation that isn't just of concern, it's horrifying. And it is the result of a relentless and deliberate aggression. As lights go up and families gather in the many parts of the world, Kiev's Christmas tree is without light. Russia's onslaught of rockets are bringing nothing but darkness. What do parents tell their children to reassure them that they're safe as the ground shakes, glass splinters, and the constant refuge and run to the bomb shelters? What do teachers tell their students about them being safe when they're not? How does a doctor reassure her patient when operating under darkness? Madam President, at today's debate, I'd like to highlight the following 3 points. 1, the need to protect civilians and preserve humanitarian space. Secondly, the deep scars that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is leaving on its people. And finally, the global consequences of Russia's war. First, on the need to respect humanitarian law. The ongoing deliberate and systematic missile attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure add to the growing evidence that Russia is committing war crimes. as reported already by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Civilian casualties are being reported from across the country. Attacks around nuclear power plants are bringing us to the brink of a nuclear disaster. And as temperatures now drop below zero, these unlawful attacks are causing a humanitarian catastrophe. There are also serious challenges to delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance because Russia is obstructing access. The situation is most severe and acute close to the front lines and in newly liberated areas. It is a fact that when the contact line moves, as Ukraine liberates its territories in the south and the east, and areas become accessible for humanitarian partners to operate, the needs of the affected people are immense. The liberation of Kherson Oblast west of Dnipro River demonstrates how Russia destroys critical infrastructure as it retreats. Indiscriminate shelling of Kherson and other areas close to the front line further hamper the delivery of urgently needed humanitarian aid to civilians. Second, the scars left by Russia's brutal war on the people in Ukraine are immense. We are very concerned by the increasing mental health and psychosocial well-being and needs of the war-affected population, and in particular children's vulnerability to conflict-related traumas, has been mentioned by so many here today. The sad reality is that Russia's war of aggression severely impacts a generation of Ukrainian children. They suffer the horrors of war every day and are in dire need of safety, stability, and protection. We therefore need to maintain well-targeted humanitarian support for the most vulnerable children in Ukraine to ensure access to education, shelter, and healthcare services, including psychosocial support, especially for those who are displaced or have been separated from their parents and therefore particularly at risk. We commend the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people, especially humanitarian workers and social workers, including educational and medical personnel, and we call for further support of the international community for Ukrainian institutions to ensure that these essential staff can stay and deliver. We also need to continue the sustained support to relevant international actors engaged in delivering help to Ukrainians such as UNICEF and the officers of the Special Representatives for Children in armed conflict and for sexual violence in conflict. Third, Madam President, on the global consequences of Russia's aggression. In the middle of a global food crisis, Russia's systematic and deliberate targeting and destruction of Ukraine's agricultural production infrastructure, grain looting, and the obstruction of exports are unacceptable and inexcusable. These actions exacerbate hunger and severe food insecurity in the world. We are doing everything possible to alleviate hunger by getting agricultural products and fertilizers to world markets. Together with the Black Sea Initiative, the EU solidarity lanes are making a significant difference and have enabled Ukraine to export 29 million tons of grains and other foodstuffs to date. Last week's launch of the Grain from Ukraine initiative, which has the EU's full support, demonstrates also Ukraine's commitment to helping those most in vulnerable situations, as we've heard today. 2 ships filled with grains are already on their way towards Ethiopia and Somalia, and this from a country that is suffering an onslaught of missiles from Russia on a daily basis. Now, the EU will continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes and to the extent necessary. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought death and unspeakable suffering. Russia must be held to account for its horrific crimes, including for its crime of aggression against a sovereign state. It must also pay financially for the devastation it has caused. Let me reiterate one more time our call on Russia to unconditionally and immediately withdraw all its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The real healing, which will take generations, can only begin once the war is over. Ukraine has indicated that it's ready for just peace, and the EU certainly supports all genuine and meaningful efforts in this respect. In the meanwhile, Russia is actively bombing civilians and critical infrastructure, deliberately blocking humanitarian access and using cold and hunger as weapons. Madam President, we are the first to acknowledge what you said, the global consequences of this war against Ukraine, and that the humanitarian situation globally is extremely challenging and requires our full engagement and solidarity. And we're proud to be at the forefront of all global humanitarian efforts, and that we do that hand in hand with OCHA. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skoog for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Taking out